So can we start the session?
Yes. Silent nods all around, Rajesh.
Am I audible, Shan? Is it okay, my voice?
You sound lovely.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the virtual panel on Transformative Innovation Policy and SDGs. This panel is part of the 8th edition of the Science Summit around the 77th United Nations General Assembly. This panel is jointly organized by Declan Crane of ISC International Brussels, Mammo Muchie of Assist UK, and Swati Mehta of Guru Nanak Dev University, India. I am Rajesh, Director of Association for South-South Cooperation in Innovation Systems Transformation, Assist UK. I moderate this panel. In this panel, we have Johan Schot, Bengt Lundvall, Judith Sutz, Rainer Kattel, Sylvia Schwaag Serger, Andy Hall, Shan Cunningham, and Mammo Muchie. We have a little more than 2 hours for this panel, which is organized in 3 rounds plus one discussion, one open discussion, open floor discussion. The first round will be introductory. It will be of 50 minutes duration, giving 7 minutes to each panelist. Johan Schot will open the first round with his vision on TIP, followed by others presenting their views on TIP and its implications to the SDGs. The second round will be a discussion on the ideas presented on the first round, adding views both complementary and critical. This round will be of 40 minutes duration, giving 5 minutes to each panelist. The turn will be voluntary. Panelists, please feel free to use the raise hand emoji or simply raise your hands. We can see you, no problem. The third round is a roundup session wherein panelists volunteer to make their final comments. This round will take 30 to 40 minutes, wherein panelists may speak multiple times, again on a raise hands basis, 5 minutes each. Finally, the event ends with a question and answer session of 20 to 30 minutes, taking questions from the floor. As all the speakers are well known and do not need any introduction, I do not venture into introducing them in detail. The first speaker is Johan Schot of the Utrecht University Center for Global Challenges, Netherlands, and also the director of the Transformative Innovation Policy Consortium and the Deep Transitions Project. Johan, your work on TIP has been apparently inspired by several schools of thought. Might include that of Sproul, the Dutch STS school, multi-level perspective of sustainability transitions, innovation and transition studies, the mission-oriented policy frameworks, etc. Yet, with TIP and deep transitions, you are creating considerable intellectual excitement, especially among those who are desperate to see changes in the current world scene, and also in meeting the ambitious challenges expressed in the SDGs. Could you give us your vision of TIP as a framework suitable for public policy to meet the SDGs in a world characterized by new digital technologies, growing global inequalities, and intensified international conflict? Over to you, Johan. You have 7 minutes. I will alert you at the 6th minute. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for putting this together, the panel, and for inviting me to talk with such distinguished leading scholars in the field. Let me first talk about the problem definition. I think we first need to agree on the problem definition. SDI policy has been called upon since the last decade or a bit earlier to address global challenges. So it needs to become challenge-led in a way. This was part of the Lund Declaration, became part of EU policy. And I think it is important for me to establish that this needs a bigger change. So in order to address these challenges, we cannot optimize our current behavior. So we need a bigger and deeper change process. When you think about climate change, the biodiversity crisis, the inequality issues, poverty reduction. And an important aspect of this is that all these challenges are related. So just working on climate change, for example, ignoring inequality or poverty is not a good idea. So we have a poly crisis that needs to be addressed, and science, technology, and innovation policy is called upon to do this. In different contexts. Then the question is the current SDI policy fit for purpose? So it's called upon to address this, but given the current thinking and given the instruments, is it fit for purpose? And I would argue it is not. There are a couple of points here. One is that SDI policy has been part of this economic growth paradigm because it was established that science, technology, innovation is very important, is the engine for economic growth. So, for example, in Europe, we say 3% needs to be spent on science, technology, and innovation, 3%, of the BNP, and any innovation is positive. We stimulate innovation. So there's not a question whether some innovations are in fact detrimental to human well-being and should not be stimulated, in fact. So this is the first point, that we need to refocus and to say that science, technology, and innovation policy is not about stimulating economic growth. This is a more radical position. I can moderate this a bit, but I think given the current discussion, I would like to say this. So it really needs to focus on social and ecological questions. And if it does so, it may also generate economic development, for sure. If you invest in solar, for example, it doesn't mean there's no development, but the development is more directed. But for example, you don't invest in fossil fuels. So that's the first point. SDI policy should not focus so much on economic growth. The second point is about the conceptualization of the change process. In my view, this is about changing what we call socio-technical systems. So these are systems of provision. So we have in our societies energy provision, mobility provision, healthcare provision, for basic needs. And these systems are not fit for purpose anymore. The energy system, the mobility, so they need to change more fundamentally. And when we say system, so we talk about technological change, but we also talk about cultural change, change of user preferences, change of policies, and all of these elements are related. So SDI policy is also about culture. It's also about users. It's not just about science and technology in a kind of traditional sense. And so it's about transforming socio-technical systems. And if you go to the SDGs, you will see that 8 SDGs are about systems. So you can relate them to systems. And then other SDGs, like reduction of poverty, climate change action, are about directionality. And there's a third type of SDG, 16 and 17, which is about the framework conditions. So it's about networking, involvement of marginalized actors and all of that. Peace. So from this perspective, from my conceptualization point of view, we have 3 types of SDGs. The ones that refer to system, directionality and governance. And we need to look at the relationship. So we need science, technology, innovation policy working on reduction of poverty, coupled to the energy system, looking for new governance framework condition in terms of participation and inclusion of actors, basically. So that's my view of the SDGs. We also need new type of instruments because the current set of instrument is not good enough, and specifically what I call a very broad term, experimentation, because we don't know, although we know the direction, the way to implement it, it will be very different in several contexts.
One more minute, Johan.
Yes.
One more minute, please carry on.
I see policy not as leading. A lot of policymakers, they think they lead change, they enable change. But I think policy should help actors who already are working on a transition to stretch them, to work with them, to make their action more transformative. So policy is about modulating ongoing change. And that's the rationale. That's what Matthias Weber introduced this term, transformational failure. So it's not about market failure. It's not about system failure, it's about transformation, overcoming transformational failure. And that is the role of the government. And that's the role of STI policy. I have more to say, but I've used my time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Johan, for keeping to the time limit and also laying the ground perfect for further discussions. Bengt, okay. Many consider you as the latest in the foursome in innovation economics after Schumpeter, Nelson, and Chris Freeman. You had a new idea for the world practically once in every 5 years. Innovation as an interactive process in early 80s, national systems in mid 80s, in the early 90s, the concept of learning economy. And now you are working on digital revolution and its impact on the world order and running economy. You have been critical of TIP with respect to the newness of the idea, it being programmatic towards replacing existing ideas, its dismissal of the concept of mission economy, etc., and its effectiveness as a framework for public policy, its relevance to the global south, etc., among other points. While bringing out your critical appraisal on what Johan has presented. Given your dislike for theorizing and your advocacy for combining attempts to build general, valid, and reliable knowledge about causalities, could we also have your views on developing TIP in alliance with evolutionary economics, mission-oriented policy frame, etc., as a real promise for the future? You have 7 minutes, Bal. I will alert you at the 6th minute. Thank you.
Thank you. After this long introduction, I don't really have to add anything. But I will. First, I would like to say that I agree with Johan on very fundamental points. One of them is that it's absolutely necessary to think climate change action in connection with global inequality. I think this is absolutely necessary, and if we do not do that, we will end up with non-working kind of solutions. But this brings us to another point, and that is that if we look at income inequality in a global context, the most important cause for growing global inequality is income differences between different national systems. And that means that your other point needs to be developed somewhat more. The point that you say we should no more think about SDI policy in the context of economic growth. I would say economic development. And I think we need to be aware that if we want to do anything serious about global income inequality, we need to actually strengthen national innovation systems in middle and low income countries. That is my first point. The second point where third point where I do agree is that there is a need for transformation of systems, and that the causes of the kind of unsustainability processes we see in relation to the climate as well as inequality are rooted in current systems at different levels, from individual, regional, national, global, and we need system transformation. I agree very much on that. My concern here is that I think the concept socio-technical system, as far as I understand it, this is what you want to promote as kind of framing for policy. As far as I understand, it has been used mainly in high-income countries, and it has been used in the within at the level of national systems. And I think we need system transformation, not only at the socio-technical level within national systems, and we need transformation of national systems. We need actually transformation of a global innovation system. And that means that we need transformation not only of each national system, but we need fundamental transformation in relation between national systems. And here I think it could be useful to draw more upon historical experience. For instance, I find the work by Christopher Freeman and Carlota Perez, where they talk about the kind of transformation which has taken place in connection with the emergence of new techno-economic paradigms, could be a very fruitful inspiration. I also think that looking more closely at the experience of China, which has actually used quite state-led transformation strategy, which has included both almost erasing poverty and also making some serious progress in climate action. So I think in general, I think we should try to link our conceptual frameworks and policy frameworks to historical experience. I think this would be my first round of comments.
Thank you, Bal, for being precise and very powerful in your approach to what Johan has presented. Now, next is Judith Judith, you have been a strong voice from the Global South and view national innovation systems and transformative change as powerful alternative concepts from a Southern perspective. You have stressed the issue of power, interactions between technology and economic, political, ideological, and military relations, the notion of underdevelopment, and also the need for frugal innovation from the Southern perspective. In this context, could you give us your take on TAP and its implications to the Global South, especially as the TAP perspective has been developed mainly by scholars from the North? Is it equally relevant for low-income countries in the Global South? 7 minutes for you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rajesh. It's such a pleasure to be here with so long friends. From a Southern perspective, the richness of the national system of innovation approach to policy has 3 pillars. First, it recognizes the specificity that history imprints on innovation. A country's history and that of its relation with the rest of the world, implying that for underdeveloped countries, dependency should enter into the picture. Second, the importance of all types of interaction among different actors. And third, the importance of learning processes, and particularly interactive learning. It offers, as did the Latin American antecedent proposed in 1968 by Sabato and Botana, an interpretative framework. From a Southern perspective, the richness of the transformative innovation approach to policy has also 3 pillars. First, it focuses on the whole spectrum of problems, particularly social problems, in which innovation should take part. 2, it insists on involvement, participation, consultation of society around the aims of innovation. Third, it explicitly rejects catching up with the North as a way of describing the directionality of innovation efforts in the South. It provides normative guidance for innovation policy. The multi-level perspective in particular is interesting. The idea of niche as protected spaces where heterodox learning may develop resonates with expectation of really productive innovation policies. It provides also an interpretative framework. From a policy perspective, the combination of these approaches is indeed powerful. It signals where to go and some of the strategies to get there. But looking at this combination from the South, 2 aspects are missing. The first aspect is the lack of attention to the different heuristics of innovation that are deployed in conditions of abundance and in conditions of scarcity. In the South, we innovate idiosyncratically, not only through grassroots innovation, but by using the most advanced science differently, following different logics of problem solving. Both ways of deviating from orthodox innovation are under-recognized and undervalued. Bringing them from the margins to the central stage is necessary to get problems solved for the majority of the world population, today excluded to a great extent from the benefits of science, technology, and innovation. Our capacity to innovate in scarcity conditions may be one of the roads toward the frugality that the world is so badly needing, particularly for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. The second aspect that is missing relates to the problems we want to solve. Whose problems are those? Usually the problems of actors who have agency to voice them. Governments, firms, organized social movements. But what about those problems without voice, without agency? Problems that are hidden, not even identified by their sufferers, and highly idiosyncratic in their manifestations. To have a truly transformative innovation policy able to fight inequality through knowledge and innovation, those problems need to be unearthed. this calls for intermediations to fulfill a task that is usually neglected. Finally, Richard Nelson wrote in 1974, I quote, "What is a problem and what is a solution are not questions that rational analysis alone can decide. The questions of what values and whose values ultimately are to count is inherently a question that must be answered through political processes." End of quotation. And Albert Hirschman wrote in 1968 that development is fundamentally about putting to work for developing forces that are hidden and fragmented. One such force is the innovation capacity in countries of the South, democratizing knowledge and innovation through policies that first foster all the strengths that until now has been disregarded by diverse forms of unilateral thinking. And second, unearth the problems of the left behind is a challenge ahead that the combination of the three approaches, duly adapted to incorporate thoroughly concerns, may help to overcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. In continuation to what, maybe in complementary to what Judith Sutz said, let me invite on Andy Hall. There is now general agreement that the STI community, that innovation has to be directed towards environmental sustainability and social inclusion, as well as economic growth. The question is how? We certainly do not want to throw away the concepts that have served us well in the past. Andy, you have been advocating a layering of approaches. Say for example, innovation systems coupled with a much stronger public goods governance framework. What is your take on it? You have 7 minutes, Andy.
Okay, I'll talk in and around that, Rajesh. So I'm sort of slightly different to many of the people on the call here, that I've been looking at the agriculture and food sector for many years, and certainly at a more kind of cold face rather than conceptual position. And, you know, what we're seeing in the agricultural sector is very much like what we're seeing in economies more generally, that we need to do something. So as people say the food system is broken, well, we argue that, of course, that the innovation system, which underpins the food system, is also broken. But then, you know, what on earth do we do about this? And I think that's Rajesh's point, that we're very interested in how do you move forward. So very much aligned to the transformational agenda, the need for system change, but thinking about where do we go from here? And my work both spans the global south, but also Australia, which is the global north in a strange southern hemisphere kind of way. But I think one of the things that strikes me as I do advisory work in different contexts is that there's this danger of bringing in innovation framings, concepts from the global north and parachuting them into the global south. And I think that's a real challenge, because it cuts off an important conversation. And that's a conversation that's meeting both in the global south, but also in Australia. And that's the question of, okay, we need to build innovation capacity and drive innovation, but what do we need to build that capacity for? And I think in most countries, that question hasn't been answered. And of course, the processes are missing to articulate the answer to that question by bringing in different stakeholders from society. So this idea of a national conversation on what sort of capacities do we need to for innovation for different purposes is missing. And what you often see is that high-level policy aspirations are about leading to the SDGs. But actually, when you unpick innovation and other policies, there isn't a clear line of sight between those aspirations and what's actually been implemented. So I think, in terms of where do we go from here, I think even as a very basic starting point, before we can start and talk about transformative policy instruments, we need to be thinking much more strongly about how do we put in place these consultative mechanisms so we can have a robust conversation, not just about what sort of innovation capacities do we need, but also what does transformation mean for different people? How does it line up with different stakeholders' aspirations? And there's a very country-specific dimension to this. We can't think about a sort of global blueprint for how we're going to do innovation for transformation. We can't think about a global blueprint for whatever our development aspirations are, what transformation is going to look like in our context. So I think that's a really important piece to start with. The second piece that we see all the time is that much of the transformational activity or activity aligned to the SDGs is largely out of sight from science and technology and innovation policy. It's under the radar of policy. There's actually lots of interesting things going on out there, but they can't be seen. In the global south, we have an enormous informal innovation sector, which is often poor people doing things for poor people, and often in the face of environmental crisis. There's a whole mountain of stuff there that's interesting, but not even impinging on the policy debate at the moment. And then the final thing that comes to mind, and this again is experience from Australia, we're starting to have a discussion in Australia about what sort of innovation system do we need in the agriculture and food sector. But the first thing that we need to do with policy players is help them monitor and evaluate what would be a good innovation system or a good innovation capacity for this transformational agenda. And I mean, that's very practical, and it sounds very boring to talk about M&E, but really that's a kind of starting point to have these broader conversations with policy and others to get a debate going about what would be the features of innovation capacity for this transformational thing, who would have to be brought into that conversation to try and think about indicators and metrics for this new type of performance that we expect from the innovation system, and then thinking about policy instruments that could start and change the functionality of innovation systems towards this new agenda, whatever that might be, and however people might articulate it. So I just sort of in summary, I think the where do we go from here point is really critical. We know that there's a major problem. We know we need systemic change. We know that transformation of systems is going to be a key to that. But actually starting to move forward in a practical sense, I think is really critical.
You're
muted.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks, Andy, for the real life experience from Australian agri-food sector. Now, Raina, you have raised questions about the sustainability of current systems. You have also pointed to the need to examine policy capacities. You have found that policy capacities for missions are not fully present, even in developed economies. In this context, how do you look at TIP as it attempts to bring together social innovation and technical innovation to address systemic challenges, and has focused on directionality in innovation policy?
Yeah, thanks for this question, and thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure and an honor to be in such illustrious society here today, and great points that have been already made. So what I would like to do with the 7 minutes and 6.5 that I have left is to try to sort of understand what is happening in practice in transformative innovation policy or mission-oriented challenge-led innovation policy. I think there is like an emerging universe of these policy practices globally. So you may remember how Hyman Minsky argued that there is like 57 types of capitalism as many as there are Heinz pickles. If you open a Heinz bottle, there is a ketchup bottle, there is 57 on it. So there is 57 types of Heinz pickles. I think there is also 57 types of transformative innovation policies. In other words, all countries are experimenting with these kind of approaches at the moment. And so there's an emerging universe for us as researchers to really understand. And I try to make a bit of sense of what's going on. And it's only, of course, very tentative. I think, first of all, there is definitely, we can see a renewed focus on state, the importance of the state as a key actor, if you will. And I think it's both in terms of like policy and bureaucracy, but it's also in terms of what do we mean by the public, in terms of who owns things, but also how do we debate things. And I think almost everybody who has gone before me has argued that we really need to ask, transformation for whom and who defines transformative. So I think this is becoming a really undercurrent and very, very important topic. And otherwise, I think we see this, as we say here at UCL, that innovation is political. I think we see everybody sort of starting to agree on this, that the goals of innovation systems are very much a political goals that need to be discussed, and we need to actually develop these kind of structure for these discussions that we haven't had before, because we have hoped that the growth provides the goals, as Johan said at the beginning. And I think now we agree that this is not the case. So I argue that we see two turns in these debates and policy practices. First is a well-known and well-described normative turn, that we go from growth to directionality. So we discuss directionality in terms of inequality, climate, and we don't take growth as a given anymore. But I think accompanying this kind of turn, there is also what I would call an epistemic turn. It is exactly how do we know about a policy? What do we think is relevant knowledge for policy? And that we just heard from Andy as well, is the question, who is actually asking those questions? So it's really about this epistemic and almost like epistemology of innovation systems. And I think we see that we are moving more from policy discussions, what instruments should we use, or accompanying these policy discussions are also questions of capacities, capabilities, and particularly how do we know it, when do we know it, who knows things. And it's very much this monitoring and evaluation that moving into focus, because this is where governments are finding it very, very tricky to move away from growth, because it's very easy to focus on growth because it's easy to measure. But everything else, systems change. It's very difficult to measure and actually communicate. And this should be increasingly the focus, I think, as well as we move from this idea of understanding various like market failures and what Johan was describing, to actually much more systemic effects of things. It's not only complex systems, but as we have heard from Judith and Andy's particularly, I think it's very much also about community. Who's actually being asked and what kind of tools we are using for engagement, for analysis, for monitoring and evaluating. And of course, this is also a question of power. And I think these are, or in other ways, this is very much a question of democracy as well, as we see, particularly in the digital space. I think the key question is not only the digital innovation system that is very much now geared towards these big platforms, but this is also eroding democratic deliberative systems that could help with this system change that are now being, I think, eroded as well. So I think we see there is a lot of things happening at the edges of innovation systems that we, SDI systems, we see a lot of interesting things happening in innovation policy labs, for instance, or in digital agencies, various design agencies being created by governments, and this is where, as Johan mentioned, the focus on users becomes so relevant. So who's actually using our policies? Who's actually our key audiences? And I think we can already, from these these emerging processes, for instance, in UNDP has this wonderful strategic innovation program in Istanbul, where they try to really take this kind of approach seriously. But even in countries like Latvia or Sweden, and you have this really interesting attempt to bring in those new forms of knowing and monitoring and evaluating, and actually much more user-focused ways of doing policy. And I think what we can learn from these are, for SDGs, I think I would say, is that the focus should be really on policy learning. So how do we learn within policy? Rather, I think because we have a lot of debates focusing on policy instruments and goals, but actually how do we learn within policy has been much less of a focus, particularly in SDI. And so what lessons that we can draw today, I think, are three lessons at least. So we are moving away from this big program, big solutions, waterfall type of solutions, to much more agile ways of working, much more closer to the ground, closer to the communities, as Andy and Judith mentioned as well, I think, which is really key. But it's also, of course, very difficult, because then you can't copy any more solutions from the global north. You have to be inventive, and you have to find your own way, which requires capacities, resources. So I think this is really important. But at the same time, I think we're also moving away from just focusing on single projects and evaluating single projects, but much more to portfolios. So putting together, as Johan was mentioning at the beginning, we want to see experimentation, because we don't believe there's a single solution globally, let alone locally, or locally, let alone globally. So we need to have experimentation in innovation policy. So that means you have to have a portfolio of solutions, portfolio of approaches, rather than and you should evaluate portfolios rather than evaluate single projects. And I think the last one I would mention is that we see that increasingly we are focusing on local rather than national level. And I think this is also why national innovation systems are, of course, incredibly important. But again, I think this idea that we on a national level can solve all of those problems is probably quite utopian. So we need to go to the level of cities and townships and local communities. And this is, again, requires capacities, requires shifting resources, which is a political discussion as well. So I think I would come back in many ways, this emerging universe of transformative innovation policy and missions and challenges is very much a shift towards much more political STI arena, which perhaps we as researchers are not as well equipped to deal with as we should, perhaps. Thank you.
Thank you, Reinhard. Coming to Sylvia, Schwaag, Serger, we have innovation systems in all countries, only at different levels of perfection or imperfection. What does transforming these systems, especially those of Global South, mean to you? Does TIP offer an adequate framework for public policy to meet the SDGs in a world characterized by new digital technologies, growing inequalities, and international conflicts?
Thank you very much, Rajesh. And I think very many interesting things have already been said. So I'd like to perhaps pick up on some of them and try to complement them. First of all, I think I would very much agree, for example, with what Andy said, and just phrase it slightly differently. I think we see a rapidly converging consensus on the need for systemic change. And this is sort of this aspirational aspect of what might be called transformative innovation policy. So I think the discussion right now, and this is what Rainer also touched upon, is moving perhaps away from trying to make the case that we actually need a different innovation policy, since we're trying to drive transformative change, towards how we actually do that. And that's, I think, what Andy was saying, the difference between the aspiration and the implementation. And I think this is really the pressing problem for policymakers in, I would say, most countries and at all levels today. And what perhaps we haven't mentioned yet is that this is happening under an immense, and I would say increasing, time pressure. So policymakers are trying to make this shift, which, just as Johan said, is not an incremental pivot from what has become a traditional STI policy towards something rather different, towards something which we don't really know what form it can or should take, and doing it under extreme time pressure and other pressures. And then the question becomes, and this is something that I think Rainer mentioned at the end, what is the ideal governance level at which to pursue transformation? I would argue that what we're seeing right now is, on the one hand, for example, the notion of missions, which in my mind is one manifestation of transformative innovation policy. It's not the only instrument by far of a transformative innovation policy. Missions are being designed and implemented at very many different levels of governance: local, regional, national, even supranational like the European Commission, which has launched 5 missions. But there's very little discussion about which governance level is actually most suited to driving which form of transformative change. And moreover, there is even less discussion of how these different governance levels could be aligned. And so that ties into what Bengt was talking about, that if we are serious about the link between the SDGs and innovation policy, we really need to start talking about the global context. Because, for example, whatever Sweden, which is where I operate, does with its 9 million people is not going to make any difference to the SDGs in a global context if we don't have a larger perspective. Now, the problem in my mind with innovation policies is that they tend to be very national in their focus. And so this is something where I would argue, just to echo Johan's point, that in many ways, national SDI policies are today not fit for purpose for tackling what they claim that they want to tackle or claim to be able to tackle. One of the things that perhaps hasn't been mentioned that Judith touched upon and others is that, exactly as Raina said, I think that in many ways, the local or regional dimension is much more credible or legitimate for driving certain forms of transformation, because there's a totally different dynamic of a social contract going on at these levels than is actually happening at a national level. So one of the things that concerns me is how we in our minds think of these different levels of governance and how they might work together, and whether the national level is actually the most suitable one for driving certain forms of transformation that we actually need to achieve. That would be my first point. The second point perhaps is that one of the things where I feel that STI policy in its current form is really not fit for purpose in this pivot towards a transformative innovation policy is that it is neglecting the things that it could bring to the table, because transformation is really about a system change, which means it can never happen only through STI policy. It has to occur in a system or in concert with other policies. And here we run into this other problem of national governments, that national policy coordination at the national level is really not aligned for the kind of coordination we might need if we want to drive transformation, and where innovation policy could play a relevant role. And the two things that I think innovation policy could bring to the table in driving transformation is perhaps some kind of theory of change, some kind of professional knowledge about how transition actually happen. Because what we see is that different policy areas have been quite successful actually in driving certain forms of transformation, such as environmental policy in some areas. But this knowledge or this learning about how transformation happened is not really systematized, and then thus doesn't become applicable to other policy areas. And the other question is how to handle conflicts, because transition and transformation is really about managing conflicts and resistance from incumbents. And that can be either between countries or between communities, but it also has very much to do with power. And I think this is something that is persistently neglected in STI policy, which is all about investing in new knowledge and in new solutions without trying to figure out how to overcome the resistance. So I think that there is, and this is really all I would say in this context, because a lot has been said. One is, what are the different levels of governance that we should be focusing on when we're really talking about transformative innovation policy? The question of how we help policymakers with not the why of transformative innovation policy, but the how under conditions of extreme time pressure. And then the third thing of how innovation policy maybe could become more make a better contribution in terms of providing some kind of theory of change, and also think a little bit more about this conflict management rather than only sort of this notion, which comes from the traditional STI policy, that sort of all innovation is good because somehow it will lead to something new. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. That was a very direct and incisive take on TAP in actual practice. Coming to Shan Cunningham. Shan, can I ask you about your experience in implementing policy, being a very slippery concept in practical life, And what is TAP for you in transforming African innovation systems, given your interest in gap between institutions, industries, and communities?
Rajesh, I had some notes prepared, but after what everybody has said, my notes now seem completely irrelevant. One thing that Johan said that really excites me, that I highlighted here because I need to ponder this a little bit more, is he said there's transformational failure. And I mean, we've over the time seen the critique of market failure and then the shift towards the system failures, but this idea of the transformational failure, I think this is exciting. Now, just something about evidence-based policymaking and evidence-based program design, the kind of things that we see in developing countries. A lot of data doesn't pick up some of the, I don't want to use the word transformation now because I don't think that's what Johan meant, but a lot of data doesn't pick up on the changes that are happening in the life of people, in the households, in relationships between businesses. There's a lot of changes that will only show up in the data at some distant point in the future. So, I think that just something about the developing countries, and one of the speakers also alluded to that, there's already a lot of small changes happening. And these changes are important because they connect to something that Bengt always speaks about, and that is competence building. The ability of stakeholders to grow in their self-esteem with what kind of problems they can take on and how they can work on those problems together. I think one thing, I think people that know me knows I'm very in love with innovation systems, but I'm also in love with its roots, evolutionary thinking. But there's one thing that is frustrating, that drives me nuts, and that is that even in countries like South Africa, the national system of innovation is still seen as a science system. And innovation is still largely seen as something that happens because clever people work together on well-funded projects towards clearly defined goals. And real life doesn't look like that. So what is, Bengt, what we've not managed to do is to get more focus on your topic of learning, this ability of different stakeholders to work on problems together. And that is where I think TIP has done something right, because you can get going. You can get going with a group of stakeholders. You can get working. And as you start working together, you can overcome some of the issues that we have real challenges with in the global South, and that is trust. Now, we don't sprinkle pixie dust and then people trust each other. For people to trust each other, they have to actually work together. And so the trust is also not as simple as a mistrust between the public sector and the private sector. The private sector doesn't trust each other. The government departments don't trust each other. The different layers in the government don't trust each other. And the community is somewhere in between, and they trust nobody. So we do have to find a way of getting people involved in solving problems together. And I think TIP offers some of that. It offers a platform for us to do that. I want to just share, just some of the experiences from practice. Often the kind of work that I do is funded by governments or international agencies. So very often you get to work with the people that are there. This is a challenge because any of you that's gone through a change process knows this is very hard. It is very hard. And there's this little pattern that plays out. People want to do a diagnosis with lots of evidence on data that nobody trusts. Then there's planning. And by the time we get to implementation, the context is shifted. I mean, just some of my clients that I'm working with at the moment, they're trying to figure out what does AI mean for us? And then the next person comes through the door and then they're trying to figure out what the Internet of Things means for us. And in the meantime, we're dealing with the challenge that technologies that are developed in the EU, for instance, to deal with a shortage of labor, in South Africa makes the problem worse. It displaces labor. So the technologies developed in one context lands very differently here. And I can see my public official clients and my private sector clients and universities are being stretched on all fronts. Their boundary, even if it's a mechanical engineering department, their boundary of technologies and changes that they're exposed to is actually quite big. So Johan, one of the challenges I have is how do we get some of these kind of departments, because I don't want to talk about the university as an institution. We all know a university is not one thing. So how do we get at a more molecule level or at a more decentralized level, institutions involved in change processes or in transformation processes still a headache. And then what I also want to just highlight is this idea of bottom up that Sylvia mentioned, and I know that Judith is also really passionate about. Our challenge in many of our developing countries is we cannot wait for policymakers to get themselves aligned. I mean, in theory, we know how we can connect these SDGs, but in practice, when you go to any city in Southern Africa, maybe below the 2 or 3 leading cities, the SDGs do not connect with each other. There isn't a local department of science and technology in a municipality or in a community level. So our problem is often that the talk about transformation and innovation policy and science and technology, or technological capability, whichever formulation you want to use, happens in the capitals and in oak paneled boardrooms with leather chairs. And we're not getting to what is transformation or what is learning or what does problem solving mean in a community where they are struggling with energy, they're struggling with water, they're struggling with pollution. And in our context down here, we're trying to create jobs and not just low paying or basic income kind of jobs. We're trying to give people a dignity and a future and a hope. I want to just end with that and connect this back to something Bengt said quite often about hope. Where does science and technology and innovation give people hope that they can try things? Where do we give them the tools and the platforms to try things? And just one thing about experiments, again, when scientists experiment, it's controlled. When individuals and entrepreneurs and communities experiment, it's often using very scarce resources. And so I've got many jumbled thoughts, so I'll leave it at that. I find inspiration in these frameworks, and I know that it's pitched often as directly opposing. And for me, I see a certain beauty in being able to draw from these frameworks. But I think that we must focus this back to what are we trying to achieve. And with that, then it ends up with the framing that Johan gave right at the beginning. The problems are very big, but I want to add the problems are also very distributed. And the people that have to solve these problems are also distributed. They're not all policymakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Shan, for those remarks from your experience. And I think this is what Andy also means by the concept of layering. Now, we have completed the first round successfully, and we are within the time limit. A number of issues have been thrown up. Moving on to the second round, anyone from the panel may come up and take the discussion forward. Bal, please. Bal, please unmute yourself.
I'm there. Thank you very much. One issue which I think appeared several times, it's about the level of analysis. Should we go to focus on the local level, on the regional level, or national level, or even global level? And I think I would like to discuss this from the point of view saying that the kind of systems we are talking about, which we want to transform, they are complex systems, and this makes it extremely. It immediately you think that this calls for quite complicated and complex packages of policy. On the other hand, we are fully aware, and I think Sylvia referred to that the problems are urgent. We need action, not in 5 years. I mean, climate change is threatening us every day. So how do we conciliate these two things? We need very complex, we might. My proposal is that the best we can do is to aim at some kind of adaptive policy learning. And one form of adaptive policy learning, which I studied together with Schwaag in China, was the fact that different regions in China, which are of the size of European nation states, they had some free hands to try out different things. And if something worked, and many of the things they did not work, many of them were too crude, and they neglected the systemic complexity, and they did wrong things. But some of them worked, and this was accumulated. So I think this was collected and transformed into more nationwide policies. So I would say, ideally, we should think in similar terms at all levels, including the global level. I mean, Rainer just said that we see, I don't know what you said, 50 different kinds of transformative policy. So let's try to systematically evaluate and see what works and why. Of course, we cannot copy. I'm very much against the idea of best practice. I don't think it exists, but learning by comparing is a smart way of going ahead. And I think that would be a very important thing. I think I will stop there. Thank you.
Johan, please go on.
Thank you. And I think we have a rich set of ideas on the table that are really complementary. I would like to work on the issue of the how, because I agree with Sylvia and others, the how question is the crucial question. And some observations I can bring from the practice of TIPSY. One is, okay, this question about coordination. We have to realize that a lot of the policy actors are part of what we call the regime. They are the incumbents. So coordination often leads to no change. I've in the Netherlands, for example, worked on the energy transition, and then the government asked, the Economic Affairs Ministry asked for coordination. It meant bringing on all the big companies and making sure radical change is not happening. So I think the call for coordination leads to paperwork and no action. It's a bit strong, but therefore I really focus on building coalitions of the willing, to use that word. It's a military word, so perhaps we should not use it, and make sure that what we call niche actors are dominant in the change process. And this is really difficult to do, because I've, for example, been watching the EU and be part of the mission boards. You see the regime actors all over the place. They set the missions. Well, we know what the outcome will be, for sure. For them, it's a way to get more R&D money for the projects they want to do anyway. So to talk about resistance is also really important, and the way, and to acknowledge that and the power play. And that's also a reason, again, why I really want to focus on niche actors, and we should make regime destabilization as part of the how. So we need explicitly to work on destabilizing the incumbents. We cannot just leave that to the market, or, you know, that needs policy intervention. And this is very difficult to accomplish. I also really like the idea of a theory of change, because that's in fact what we have been doing in TIPSI. So what we do, we have a project, for example, we worked with Vinova. They want to develop a food policy. And then we try to articulate with them a transformative theory of change, working with them in interaction. And you find out, if you do that, how difficult it is. And you also find out the lacking of capabilities with even Vinova. You know, Vinova is kind of one of the best actors in the field, you could say, a front runner, but they really miss capability because they're used to handing out money, basically. And they have a whole administrative process, but to become a strategic actor themselves, very difficult. So the question about capability raised by Rainer and by many others is core, and how to solve that well, a question I'm really trying to explore now. So any ideas on this would be important. Finally, I've started to work a lot with private actors, because if you really think about transformation, on the one hand, we need a lot of capital, and a lot of that capital is provided by private actors. For example, I work with Daily Gifford. They invest 400 billion, you know, big institutional investors. So we need to start working with investors, in fact, and because policy on itself is not sufficient. So the how question is also about coalition building with private investors, from philanthropy to institutional investors to impact investors. And that's what I'm doing in the Deep Transition project. And there are clear openings now, because they realize they don't, you know, really contribute to the solution at the moment. So a lot of investments are dysfunctional. Thank you.
Sylvia, please.
Thanks a lot. I wanted to tie a little bit what Shan said, and then also Bengt and Johan right now. I mean, I totally agree with you, Bengt, about this notion of adaptive policy learning and policy experimentation. And what we've seen has been extremely successful, for example, in China for several decades. I think one of the problems is that there is a lot of policy experimentation going on. And I worked at Vinova for 10 years and we were very engaged in that. But one of the problems, and it ties a little bit into what you said, Johan, which is existing regimes, is that there's a lot of experimentation without intention to scale. And this, I think, is something that also needs to be addressed. So in some cases, governments actually use experimentation sort of as an excuse. You know, they're saying we're trying this and that, and this region is trying that, but there is really no intention to scale, because that would require a completely different mobilization of resources. The other thing is this idea, I think, that Judith brought in, which is who defines the problem and who owns the problem. And I think that ties into what you were saying, Shan, very much about this notion of trust and hope. I mean, I think it's extremely important. We will not achieve the systemic changes we need in time if we don't mobilize or get the buy-in from wide parts of our communities, including industry. And so therefore, the question of who defines the problem and feels an ownership for it becomes crucial. And that's what you're saying, Johan. It's, you know, we need to bring different people to the table than what we have been doing. And so I think that's how these notions tie in, because that then would also hopefully give hope and create trust if you bring in other voices to set the problem agenda. And so I just totally agree with what you said, the coalition of the willing. I think that's one of the keys. But anyway, those were just some brief reflections.
Rainer, please.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for all these reflections. Really, really fascinating, and I very much agree with what people have said before me. So just to add some sort of points, I think we very much focus on our SDI policy needs to change and reach towards other areas of policy. But I think as important is also that other areas of policy and departments are actually thinking about innovation as well, because this is much larger segment of public sector. If you think about transportation, energy, these are systems that are largely outside of the typical SDI policy. And so they should also be starting thinking much more towards the SDI policy. And I think this is something that, again, we should have a much more exchange, let's say, between those scientific policy communities as well, which again is quite difficult because our funding streams are different, our jobs are different, careers are different. So I think there is something about creating those spaces to have these kind of discussions. I think the second thing is, I think we should very seriously also ask ourselves whether the organizations that we have built in 20th century, in public sector particularly, that are expertise driven, that are quite insulated, because this is sort of the state autonomy idea that the state needs to have this autonomous core, the embedded autonomy of Peter Evans. Whether this idea is still valid, because what we're talking about here is that we need organizations that are able to be much more open, much more flexible, much more nested in communities, and rather than perhaps this government, big autonomy of big government. And I think this is where I think this idea of capabilities, and particularly the sort of dynamic capabilities of government agencies, that they are actually themselves engaged directly in markets and trying to shape those markets for outcomes. And that what Johan mentioned, and Sylvia mentioned, that it's so difficult, even in leading agencies in the global north, to find those capabilities, I think is very much a reason for concern, that we have built up these organizations and fund them very generously. And at the same time, we all sort of know that they are actually not capable of what we think they should be doing. So I think this, in the organizational design question, I think becomes very, very important. That leads to human resources in civil service systems. How do we actually hire people, promote them? Can we bring people outside of civil service? So it's interesting to see, like, very big countries like Germany, for instance, is having very big difficulties in actually creating a much more open and flexible innovation agencies, because they are used to thinking very big systems, and these systems change in centuries, or maybe decades if they're lucky. So I think that's my second point. Third, I very much like this idea of destabilization of the system, but I think this is in itself a very political question, right? So it's who can and why can they destabilize? Where does the legitimacy come from? And this is something that we, in an innovation debate, we always see it the other way around, because we think, that this is the Silicon Valley model of move fast and break things, right? But now we are thinking about how do we move fast and fix things or make things better at moving faster. So I think this is implicitly a difficult question about political structures, because I think we implicitly understand that this era of political systems of big parties does not actually fit for this purpose, because they are also very slow-moving. Mass political movements are by nature slow-moving as well. They can suddenly make movements and elect different kind of governments, but they are not good for everyday work for innovation agencies to get feedback and disrupt the incumbents. So I think, again, this focus on political, the way we shape political discussions around innovation, I think is really fundamental as well. Thank you.
Shan, your turn. Shan.
Thank you. Brilliant. I must say that I also like the idea of this destabilization of the system. But one thing that I immediately thought of, just again from the countries where I'm working, Johan, one thing that I don't fully understand yet is, for instance, if you take Sasol Petrochemicals here in South Africa, that is a very big elephant in the room in our local system. But it's also an extremely important anchor in the pension funds of most public officials, actually most retirement funds, tied intricately to the performance of the stock exchange and I mean, you can now I used Sasol, but you could use any of the major mining companies in its place. And so, you know, the thing when we start talking about destabilizing the system, you know, the reason why one also get this kind of pushback is because the alternative investment vehicles don't exist. You know, let's just say the Public Investment Commission wanted to move its money. You know, so I think I hope this is not why some people say the ideas from the North won't work in the South, because I think that would be the wrong assumption to make from this. But I understand also why there's so much kickback. But I wanted to actually comment just on evolutionary thinking and just go back to that for the moment, because what I'm struggling a little bit with is, look, I understand the need to design these alternative projects, Johan. I fully get that, because if we don't have these projects, our stock of ideas that we could use and recombine in the innovation process and adapt is going to be urgent, you know, suffocated. But what I'm struggling with is the evolutionary part, where evolution also draws from ideas that work. Now, I understand if TIP is going to create modules that we can combine, then that will fuel the evolutionary process. But just what I'm experiencing in the public sector very often is they want to design the evolution instead of enable the feedstock on which the evolution works. You know, so they just to disconnect that, we need to get the order right, because I mean, you and I know from an evolutionary algorithm, we want to increase the variety of options that the system can select from. We definitely want to tweak how selection is made. I think you've argued this point, you know, many times. And then the third thing that we also have to get right still in South Africa is then we need to amplify the ideas that works, because you know, we need to get it out there so that other people can combine this into their work. So, you know, for me, there's a tension between the demands on public sector and maybe on large investors to design projects that in a way is robust. And, you know, the need that I think we all understand that we want evolution to take a slightly different direction, and we need to change the feedstock and the whole process, the algorithm works. I hope I didn't entirely mess that up, but from an evolutionary economics perspective, we know that the kind of institutions that are available makes it easier for more people to participate in the evolutionary process. And so I want to connect that back to what Rainer also said. Our challenge in the Global South is very often we have only a few institutions, and I'm not talking also of publicly funded organizations. I don't want to mention their acronyms because I might offend somebody, but you know, when a new thing comes along, they very quickly add that to their list of things that they do. But it's still the same organization. And if you told me we have to destabilize those, I agree with you fully. But I just want to come back to this thing that we can't design the perfect evolution. We have to somehow feed it oxygen and the right nutrients. I would love to hear you and the others just also, you know, talking about that.
Judith, please.
Okay, thank you, Rajesh. The experience of the pandemic in Uruguay show the extremely importance of innovating in scarcity conditions. Lives were saved because of that. We weren't able to buy anything in the world market. The hoarding of the rich countries put away, from nasopharyngeal swabs to kits to 995 masks. We didn't have anything. And what happened was that a huge demand towards our capabilities were able to mobilize a sort of collective emergence of people making knowledge, making innovation, solving problems. And so the question is this sort of encapsulated social experiment that we get through the pandemic something that we can reproduce? Because after all, water sanitation, food, everything could be thought in the same terms of urgency, clarity of demand, of knowledge demand, mobilizing people to solve problems, and picking up and applying the solutions. So the question is, are we going to be able to find a structural policy way of putting urgency to work in all the problems that are associated with the Sustainable Development Goals? I know I am talking at the country level, but we know that 1,000 solutions done in scarcity condition may be solution in other southern countries. And so this can be of a global level and perhaps for the North as well, because frugality is in our future, without any doubt. And so how can we do that? I am not sure, but I think that if we can instill in every in every public policy, social policy, food policy, transport policy, housing policy, the idea that they are also science, technology, and innovation policy, that they are the source of demand for knowledge production and innovation. This could be a way of putting things into movement. And on the other way around, if we make science and technology and innovation policy accountable for the solution of those problems, not only how much exports we can, how much money we can, this idea of, I agree with Bengt in the sense that we need economic growth, particularly the most poor country need economic growth. It's absolutely clear. But gearing innovation efforts only for economic growth has been terrible all these decades in the global south. So how can we make accountable science, technology, and innovation policies for these other goals? This kind of combination of making public policy part of science, technology, and innovation policy, and the other way around, science, technology, and innovation policy part of all the other public policies, is something that has been possible to do in the case of health public policy during the pandemic. And I think no reason why we cannot expand this experience to other situations.
Andy, do you want to comment? Your microphone has gone mute.
I couldn't find out how to put my hand up, and I couldn't find out how to switch the mute off. I just want to make a couple of points which are probably out of sync with the conversation because I couldn't put my hand up. But I want to make a couple of points about organizations in the transformation process and the challenges they face, the role of public policy in the changing world that we have, and some thoughts about how we engage policy in some of this transformational issue. I mean, my perspective comes from somebody working within the public sector. I work in the National Science Agency in Australia, and we've been experimenting with missions as a way to try and push some of these transformational changes. And we can have a side discussion about whether missions are the right way to do that or not. But what's been interesting in observing these efforts is that even though they're well-meaning and want to start and drive deeper transformational changes, they get sucked back to business as usual because of the rules of the game, let's call it, within our organization, where often revenue generation trumps impact agendas. And there's a long historical reason why we're set up like that. And part of that history, of course, is that we live and work in what has been a laissez-faire political system. We let the market drive where we want to go, and everything will be all right. But what we're seeing in our own organization, that, okay, there's some things that are under our control that we can change the rules of the game to think more about transformation. But many of the things are way out of our control and are much more in the broader innovation system and the political sphere. So, we could argue that we're going to try and do bottom-up steering of how this whole environment changes. But I think there's limits to that. And, that maybe this is a political point as much as anything else. We've had 2 decades, 3 decades, I can't remember how long, of rolling back the state and letting the market drive. But I think we need to be rolling it back in. And certainly what I see in Australia is that if we're really going to change the way we think about innovation and drive it in new directions, we've got to have a much, much stronger public policy push. And whether that's in a industry and innovation portfolio or across the whole of the ministerial portfolios, we need to have a much more proactive push to support the sorts of innovation futures that the country wants. So that's kind of the first point. But that's not worth saying unless we deal with the other issue, which is, well, okay, policy is quite often disconnected from the interesting stuff that's happening on the ground. And, I think this idea of experimentation is really important. And, back in the old days when I used to do farmer participatory research, we used to say, let's engage scientists in farmers' experiments so that will reframe how we think about science. I think we're now at a point where we need to engage policy actors in these transformational experiments to help them reframe how they think about policy. And that's not going to solve all the problems of the world. And as I say, I think the dear old monitoring and evaluation thing is actually critical, but that combination of engaging them in learning opportunities in experiments, driving this policy learning approach with stronger and more democratic metrics around what an innovation capacity for sustainability and transformation might look like, I think is really important. So, I mean, my kind of final point, yes, policymakers are part of the incumbent regime, but we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because we're going to need that public policy lever to make some of these changes that actually no one else is probably able to do. I said my piece.
So that this marks the end of the second round. Do we go for a third round of discussions?
Should we see if anybody has comments from the audience? Or?
There are some, but very less number of comments. So do you want the questions to be asked now? After the questions, KJ has raised hand from the floor. KJ, please come forward. Can you speak? KJ, can you hear me? KJ, you are muted. Yeah.
Good evening from India, and good morning and good afternoon as appropriately to all of this excellent panel. It was really, really enlightening. And the question, we are today confronted with old problems with new higher intensity, and we have got new problems. And the innovation community thinks that innovation is both the source of the problem and also it is the solution. And at this juncture, this new thought process of transformative innovation policy is really, really encouraging. But as far as a developing country scholar concerned about innovation, innovation system, I have a major problem because in my mind, innovation, when we are linking to development, innovation system is seen not at a narrow level, but at a broader level, not STI policies, but as Judith said, all other policies to the extent to which it influences development. We had a long debate from growth to development, now to transformation. Now, we also believe that innovation is quintessentially an interactive learning process, and that learning process leads to knowledge, and that learning again can be at the STI mode of learning and also DUI mode of learning. STI mode of learning leads to scientific knowledge, and the other one leads to synthetic knowledge or more experience-based knowledge. Innovation is not just science-based innovation, it is experience-based, much more than that. Now, once we have this kind of a broader approach to innovation and learning as the core of innovation, interactive learning, and then your development divide, inequality, all has to be seen as a progeny of the learning divides. This much is very well known for the innovation scholars. And how you are able to address the problem is quintessentially a function of your institutional architecture in which the whole process of interactive learning takes place. And this is a co-evolutionary process. Now, with this in mind, my problem is, what are the additional insights? I must also say that it is rather academic cruelty or rather injustice to give 7 minutes to someone who is coming with a new insight. We should have given much more time, in fact. And I'm sure there will be much more to speak about on that. So my problematic is, what is transformative in this transformation process? What is transformative as in contrast to the existing mode of understanding in the South? I'm talking about South, North is also an important problem. I'm not getting into that. Now, what is the extra value addition we are actually getting? That is very, very important, so that we can have much more informed policy, informed dialogue. So this is my my concern question. So.
Thank you, KJ, for that.
Also, one more point I would say that since I am talking from down south of India, Kerala, we have shown that without growth at a very lower per capita level, Kerala has shown that you can have developmental outcomes, which Professor Mathiasen has already publicized this idea. I'm not the one to say it. It is already known to the rest of the world. So I think I must stop here. Thank you very much. It was really, really an illuminating panel, and I'm sure it is going to start an excellent, it's good beginning of an excellent discourse, which we need to do.
We see another hand up. Attila Havas, please come forward.
Thank you. I think I don't even try to praise how interesting, exciting, and insightful this discussion was so far. I try to go to my simple point straight. Several colleagues have mentioned either level of governance or levels of analysis. I would like to comment on that, namely that actually when we are faced with real life problems, sectoral, regional, national, or global innovation, global is not, but sectoral, regional, technological, national innovation systems, this is a kind of artificial slicing for analytical purposes. Actors, either individuals or citizens or businesses, they are sitting in the interjection of all these. So they are in the local system, they are in the regional system, technological system, national and global as well. So related to that, Sylvia was asking about the ideal level of governance. I think the trouble is that perhaps at a later stage, it was mentioned that actually what is needed is multi-level governance. So not just orchestrating policies across policy domains, but also policy tools, policy approaches across levels of governance. And then we face another major problem, namely that most, if not all, the fundamental challenges are global in their nature. And yet, I think we simply do not have global governance mechanisms. We have the Global Development Goals, but so those are very nice on paper, and sorry, not global, but Sustainable Development Goals. So they look very nice on paper, and they represent a new way of approach, new way of thinking. But in practice, the UN is not up to that. So what Johan has mentioned, that it's important to work with various types of private actors, that might be a way out, but it is still not a governance mechanism. I stop here. So of course, I don't have a solution, but I wanted to raise these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Havas. We have yet another question from Jahan Pirali. Is Jahan still around?
Yes, I am. I don't know if I have a question or a comment. Thank you first to the panelists for a superb intervention. My comment is that we have falling behind countries, and their status have hardly changed since the 1960s. If we look at countries like Burundi, they have performed worse through time than better, right? So my first point was that as innovation scholars, we contribute to the field. We come up with these new frameworks for helping policy making, while the problems in those falling behind countries have not changed. So the frameworks are changing, but the problems are staying the same. So we contribute to the problem of policy inertia, because when you add new innovation frameworks with bad governance, you will find what Sean was saying before, there's lack of trust in government, or each department is going to say, I'm going to do transformative innovation now, when they never even tried to do national innovation system before, right? So in those countries where policymaking capabilities are not there, we kind of bear responsibility in exacerbating the problems, because the problems have not changed, bearing in mind that local governance and institutions have to be in place first, right? And the other thing is that in that discussion of in TIP, in that discussion is that, again, I'm talking about falling behind countries because I'm from the South, global South, but I'm a professor in the North, is that we often do not talk about the realities that global governance has created. WTO, for example, right? So we've heard about China and how China has developed and moved forward and so on, but the policy instruments that many of those countries that have managed to code up and not catching up with other countries, like Judith said, but just developed over time, those policy instruments are not available to falling behind countries today, right? Because the WTO have made those instruments illegal. So we have to consider those realities as well. We can't just have a conversation about TIP and not consider, and I am very glad that many of you have talked about the specificity of history and the context specificities of countries. And now we need to talk about the context specificities of falling behind countries, because that just adds another layer of problem to moving behind, moving forward and becoming sustainable. That's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Jahan. Now, Bengt, please.
Thank you very much. I would like to I see Johan has commented the discussion on economic growth in the chat section, and I would like to see how we can reconcile the idea of directionality and economic development. One very interesting example is some of the work by Jan Fagerberg. It was done mainly in the context of Europe, but I think the basic ideas could be applied at the global scale. His idea was to say that transformation is not only about new inventions or developing completely new and different technologies. There are already there a series of rather major green technologies which could and should be rolled out with a certain velocity given the urgency of the problem. One way to promote economic development in low and middle income countries would be to, and here I refer to the last speaker, Johan, would be to give intellectual property rights to such technologies. It would be to offer strong subsidies to rolling them out in the South. Of course, with great respect for the local context in the style of what Andy Hall was speaking about. It should, of course, be part of national strategies which were rooted in the local countries. I think that is one very practical way. Of course, Johan is right that lots of economic growth is not for the best of humanity or even for the country, for the citizens in the country where it takes place. But this, I cannot see that this means that we can neglect economic development. I have just one more question to in this context, and that is that Johan, he refers to social technical system. And I would like to know if you regard the production system as a social technical system, or if you regard that as irrelevant for the transformation. For me, the transformation of the production system, which takes learning among workers, engineers, managers, and new institutional forms, is at the very core of any kind of transformation. Do you agree on that?
So, would Sylvia wish to speak before Johan answer the question?
No, it's fine if Johan wants to answer first.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so, you know, normally when we talk about the economy, we talk about all the sectors. And I would like to get away from that because we neglect consumption, in fact, and we separate production from consumption. So a socio-technical view is that the economy consists of socio-technical systems. So you have a whole range of systems, and in each system, of course, there is industry involved. And so yes, production is important, but only focus on production is part of the problem. I agree that the role of workers has been neglected until now in the whole thinking about transformative innovation policy, in fact, and that is a problem. So, so I agree with that point.
Sylvia, please come forward.
towards the end of this session, I'd like to maybe bring up what might be a little bit controversial, but it ties into what Johan wrote in the chat about the role of universities. And one of the things I'm struggling with right now is the role of science in driving transformation. And it's 2 points. One is that there's an interesting study in Sweden that shows that, sometime, in the 60s, there was this idea that research should be more oriented towards the global challenges. It's actually not a new concept and the problems of underdeveloped countries, but somehow Sweden drifted away from that and research policy became separated from, for example, development aid or research aid. So as a result, we have a lot of research that doesn't really focus on the most pressing problems of the global poor, if we could say like that, or underprivileged. And that's one problem I would argue with science. And the other one is that science, to me, and coming back to this notion of time and the pressure we're facing as a challenged planet, is that science is, to me, about the eternal promise of a better future, while not really focusing on the very present problems of most people in the present. So it comes back to this notion, do we need to think about a difference between science policy and innovation policy, with innovation policy then focusing on really driving change? Because simply the enhancement of knowledge on its own, I guess we've seen, is not necessarily going to drive the change that we want to achieve. So I just wanted to put that out there, because that's something that kind of concerns me a lot right now. And we always mix the two. And a lot of scientific research is obviously sold to funders under the promise of solving pressing problems.
Andy, do you want to intervene?
Yeah, I guess I should, since I work for a national science agency. I think this is something that the science community's been struggling with for years. And, our own organization has flipped between a university without students, where we did a lot of basic research without a very good line of sight to how it impacts society, almost too much the other way, so that a lot of our focus is on how can we engage with industry, commercialize products, have impact, and it's sort of starting to swing back to saying, actually, there's a bit in the middle where we need to think about these grand challenges, and we know that the grand challenges are going to disrupt us, and we want to prepare to do that. So I think it's very easy to paint research, science and universities with this sort of brush of saying, well, it's all about basic research. I think a lot of the public science agencies, well, certainly in my part of the world, are acutely aware of these challenges, but shifting the rules of the game within those organizations to allow us to be more agile and impact focused and think about new ways of engaging with transformation. It's a long journey, but I think it's a journey that these organizations are on. It's an active debate, but that challenge is not just restricted to countries like Australia. Across the globe, the role and relevance of science agencies within this transformation agenda is going to have to be revisited. I mean, we were struggling with the innovation system agenda, and now we're going to struggle even further with the transformation one. So I think it's on our radar, but yeah, work to be done.
Sean, do you want to speak now or after Judith?
Judith's going to go first.
Your microphone, Judith. Your microphone, yeah. Judith, you're muted, yeah.
Let me see. Okay. Thank you, Sean. You are a gentleman. No, in the issue of universities, this is an absolutely central issue. Nothing that we are talking about is going to happen if we don't change the soul of universities. And this is absolutely and directly related with academic evaluation. And we have some good news. Around the globe, academic evaluation is changing, is being challenged. And this is a huge movement against a very entrenched elite status group. And it's very difficult. But the Netherlands are doing really well on that. The Declaration of Research Assessment is working very hard around the globe. And so I think that we are going to see the institutional call for academic solidarity, and this is going to be very important. So I think that university, it's not easy to change universities, and moreover, when universities are conceptualized as a business service, as it is in the Anglo-Saxon tradition. But fighting this is one of the sideways of the systemic struggle for reorienting directionality towards what we want. And perhaps in this point, I think that we can be optimistic because it's very precise and we can fight and we can unite, and there is a global movement against the way of looking only into papers and this kind of rankings. And so I am working on that, and I'm seeing how this is changing, and perhaps we are going to have some positive news in the future.
Okay, so yes, thank you. So I wanted to just bring the point about universities. Just again, I have a challenge with a big university. I often think along the lines of disciplines, and as Rainer said in the chat, research chairs and so on. The work of Mary Shirley inspired me quite a bit some years ago. She's a new institutional economist, and one of the points that she made is the importance of academics and scholars to introduce alternative paradigms. And this is very critical because this is what we very often need. And Johan in the chat also just pointed out the challenge is often that the universities are so focused on citations. Something that I'm seeing here in Southern Africa, but I'm also experiencing this in my work in Eastern Europe, is because of this emphasis on science, technology, and engineering skills, other kinds of skills then don't get as much attention. And we actually often also need non-engineers. We need good managers. We need, we need good social scientists. So just the role of universities, again, with this very narrow STI focus, they focus on scientists. And yes, we are short scientists and engineers, but we are also short people of all, other disciplines as well. So I just wanted to bring that in, that universities, and I mean, I'm an example of that, Erika, I think she's listening, offered me a position at her research chair at the University of Johannesburg. And there are certain things that I can do from that chair, also in terms of getting a message across to the private sector or the public sector, because the universities are esteemed. Even if they are part of the problem, they are esteemed. And therefore there's certain, one can use those platforms to also get messages across. So I wouldn't want to just say the universities are part of the problem without acknowledging that they also have an important role to play.
Right.
Yeah, just a quick comment to my comment in the chat. I think, universities are, of course, very, very old institutions. The way they have set up, they have been existing hundreds and hundreds of years. So they are the ultimate incumbents that are very difficult to change. I think for a good reason, of course, also because the idea is, of course, that you give enough specialization and freedom for very good people to experiment in their science. But I think what universities have been much weaker at is actually experimenting their own the way they actually are organized. Or there's a call coming in from my parents. Otherwise, this is what happens when you talk on Zoom. So that, yeah, I think what we actually should try to do is to see how we can actually experiment in the way universities are organized. For instance, the way degree programs are organized, the way departments are organized. This is what universities are very reluctant to do because this means taking away funding or jobs. And so I think this is where our focus really could be. The experimentation, rather than again thinking that we need to do big university reform, we should start with the willing, as Johan said as well, also within universities. And I'm sure there are departments that are really happy to work together across the board and find new ways, because it's, you know, in our own field, we know everybody anyway, so you know people what they think. But if you go to anthropologists or historians or medical people, you don't know what they think. That's the beauty of being surprised, and that's where invention and innovation come from eventually.
So we have, I think we have completed all the 3 rounds. Now still we have a little more time to take questions from the floor. If anybody wishes to interact, please switch on the mic and speak from the audience. If not, we can move the question. Is that okay with the panel? Yes, is it okay? We wind up the session. Is any panelist would like to speak? Okay, so we are coming to the.
Well, I would like to thank you for organizing this. So
thank you very much.
I think we had a wonderful, constructive discussion, in fact, because I think the situation is that we need each other, although we have different perspectives sometimes, but we work towards similar goals. So we should really align and not make the mistake that many people on the left always make, that they quarrel internally instead of, you know, keeping the eye on the ball. So thank you for organizing it.
May I say to Johan that I think the concept of a socio-technical system is useful, and I think the idea of transformation policies, which are more sectoral, is interesting. But I also think that the transformation of the production system, production and consumption system, is at least as important. And I think we could have a division of labor. So you just keep working on the socio-technical system. And some of us try to understand better the transformation of the innovation and production system.
Good compromise.
Okay. We are coming to the end of this session. This panel has been drawn with an objective, as Johan rightly mentioned, of bringing together contrasting views on the latest and a very important innovation policy framework. This has been a great learning opportunity, even though the 20 minutes put together time given to each speaker is a severe injustice from our part. But then this is just a beginning. We propose to organize more panels like this in future. Have we reached any solid resolutions? Definitely no. But sure, there are a few insights gained. TIP can be seen as layered upon, but not fully replacing earlier policy paradigms of science and technology policy and innovation systems policy. Despite a common agenda for transformative change, there are notable differences concerning the understanding of the innovation process. A caution, however, is stressing the political nature of paradigm change and the strong legacy of an economic, firm-centered, and technology-oriented tradition in innovation policy. There is a need for more emphasis on a broader conceptualization of transformative innovation and a socio-technical understanding of innovation. This would provide several appropriate analytical concepts that can help to shape our thinking and understanding of transformative innovation policy. So with these words, let us wind up the session. Thank you all. Thanks, Johan, for taking out your precious time. You were otherwise busy, I know. Thanks, Bengt, Shan, Judith, Rainer, Sylvia, and my special gratitude to Andy Hall, who is sitting. This is time he should be sleeping around 4 o'clock in Canberra. No, it is
3 o'clock. 3 o'clock.
3 o'clock.
It could be worse.
It could be worse. So I think it is the importance and it is the strategic importance of this topic that has drawn you to this panel. And so let me thank you profusely. Thank you, everyone. And good night or good afternoon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Great seeing you.
Bye-bye from El
Thank you.
Salvador, Central
Great
America.
discussion, and do it again, Rajesh. Have a follow-up, Ken.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rajesh.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Rajesh.
everybody.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you.
Thank you.